All right. So hi, everyone, and welcome to our training on enhancing motivation for dually diagnosed individuals and their support. I'm Kristen Klein. I'm an LPCSD, AADC, and an SAP, and I'm the clinical lead specialist for Mariki's dual diagnosis treatment team. And I will let my co-host, Dr. Kumpf, introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kevin Kumpf. I'm the clinical director for Mariki's dual diagnosis treatment team service line, as well as the intensive transition service line in California. I am a licensed professional counselor, a national certified counselor, as well as an approved clinical supervisor. And I also teach graduate level counseling courses at the university level.
Thank you. So, as I said in opening, we're going to be talking about utilizing motivational interviewing in an adapted way to support individuals who are dually diagnosed with mental health and co-occurring IDD diagnoses, as well as those that support them. So natural support, paid support, be staff or other external providers, residential care, and we have a number of learning objectives today for you guys for this presentation. So the first thing we hope that you walk away is to learn the importance of really attending to preferences and strong assessments in treating individuals who are dually diagnosed in care. The second learning objective is to learn the importance of intrinsic motivation when working with individuals who are dually diagnosed, and as well as their supports, as their motivation is an important factor in the individual recovery as well. We're going to talk about the principles and the spirits of MI, motivational interviewing. But there's some jargon that goes along with the motivational interviewing. So it's important to know the key concepts so you can sort of understand how to employ the information we're going to be talking about with individuals and their support to motivate them in treatment. And we'll talk about ways to integrate motivational interviewing into treatment with individuals who are dually diagnosed, as well as their support. So as everyone knows, the most important thing when working with any population is developing a good rapport. Without a strong rapport, without the person having a sense of trust, a sense that you're going to be able to help them, a sense that they're safe in your care, they're going to be a lot less hesitant to share, to be super engaged, and it's going to be a lot harder to motivate them. Our individuals, meaning those who are dually diagnosed with mental health and IDD diagnoses, are often treated using really prescriptive and direct methods of treatment. So if you think about kind of that standard medical model of care, like you do this, I tell you when, and you go here, you do this first, and then you get to do that. A lot of times when they go see psychiatric providers or even their PCP or other specific professional supports, the staff or a family member is talking for the individual rather than the individual answering for themselves. So it's very easy for treatment to get off track. A lot of times plans are built around what the natural supports or say paid residential supports want for the person, but not what the person wants for themselves, which is a problem. This often leads to disengagement, irritation, and it can also put the individual, as well as their supports, if they have natural supports, into a passive role, which isn't what we want. We want people to build that sense of self-efficacy. We want them to be motivated for their own intrinsic wellness so that they can move into recovery and so that they can, continue to build self-efficacy and independence moving forward. Rather than putting them into like a passive role where we'll tell them what to do and how to do it, we want to figure out what motivates them and then build upon that to work in a strengths-based manner to increase their capacity as well as their motivation. So that rapport is very important, but it's not the only thing that matters, obviously. You want to make sure that you utilize evidence-based assessments as well as a thorough battery of assessments. Now, in addition to evidence-based assessments that are going to look at things like mental health symptomatology, adaptive behaviors, ADLs, functioning skills, there's usually a large battery of assessments where folks go through when they start a new treatment service. But you also want to do a lot of interviews and observations, not only for behavioral data and to get, psychosocial history and a timeline and all that good stuff, but you want to figure out their preferences. You want to figure out what they really want. What do their supports want? You know, what does the family see as the trajectory for this person? What does the individual want to do with their life? What are their hopes? What are their dreams? What are their goals in recovery? Until you kind of have that piece of it and you understand what's going to motivate them and what they want to do, treatment can really go off kilter. Again, sticking to very prescriptive, very direct methods typically does not work well for our folks. They can get irritable, they can get angry, sometimes, you know, there's verbal behaviors or physical aggressive behaviors, but a lot of times it's just simple disengagement or, again, being put in that passive role where they kind of just sit back and let people tell them what to do, which is no better, you know, than them not doing well with those other issues. So we always say offering choice is important in the early assessment phase and practicing shared decision-making. So shared decision-making, something that's been around for a while, but especially thinking about shared decision-making with motivational interviewing, there's a good bit of research in the early 2000s on why that's important. So working with the individual using shared decision-making and their supports means that you're offering choice and that you're talking through possibilities and sharing in the decision-making. So rather than simply telling a person, you know what, you dropped out of high school 4 years ago, you need to go back and get your GED, we'd sit there and talk. So, you know, I noticed you haven't worked in a couple years and you're not in school right now. Do you want to do a program? Are there activities you're interested in? Is there a career you're looking at? So you want to kind of talk through what the options are and then obviously pick things that are feasible for that person and their supports, but also things that they're interested in. Again, staying away from that directive prescription model of care, saying, you know, you need to go get your GED or you need to start this program. Sometimes that happens and then things go awry because that's not what the individual wants. So obviously you need that buy-in before you're going to go down the rabbit hole of assessments and writing plans and being very prescriptive. And sometimes that's easy and sometimes it's not. One evidence-based way to enhance motivation while also building strong rapport, which we said is important, is utilizing motivational interviewing. So the nice thing about motivational interviewing is that it is now evidence-based to use with individuals who are dually diagnosed and their supports. So motivational interviewing is a really, really broad term. There are a lot of caveats. There are a lot of activities you can do with motivational interviewing, and motivational interviewing pairs great with many other evidence-based practices. So whether you're very person-centered in your methodology, you know, you follow Gestalt practices, humanistic practices, maybe you're more behavioral-based, ABA-based, you can use motivational interviewing with just about anything. There are some adaptations you might want to consider. We'll show you some visuals and a little bit of tools that we like to utilize with individuals who are dually diagnosed to help sort of gauge their motivation and gauge their preference. Motivational interviewing is extremely easy to learn. It does take some time to master, but the more you practice it, the better you get. Anybody can use it. So, you know, if you're a parent of an individual who's dually diagnosed listening in, if, you know, your direct support, you know, master's level, doctorate level, anybody can use this, learn how to use it, and use it effectively. So the idea of motivational interviewing started out in the drug and alcohol world, and it was utilized as a way to move people through the stages of change in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction. Very quickly, it caught on because it works really well, and they started to use it more and more in the mental health world, co-occurring disorder, multi-diagnosis support, dually diagnosis support, and then eventually even into directly the IDD population not identified as dually diagnosed. Because again, you can adapt it and you can use it with anybody. Personally, I use it when I have a customer service issue. I'm telling you, you'll love it. It works great. So like I said earlier, it's not a specific structured set of skills or a specific practice, specific phases like something like EMDR or trauma-focused CBT where you have to go through a lot of courses and be certified, although there are MI certification courses you can take if you'd like to learn more. The idea is that you are meeting individuals or their supports, if that's who you're working with, to increase motivation, increase engagement, increase their interest in their recovery. But it's all about meeting them where they're at. So if you think about that, sort of the initial intention of motivational interviewing for individuals suffering from addiction to drugs and or alcohol, it's all about meeting the person where they're at. Sometimes that's choosing harm reduction. Sometimes it's being a little bit more engaged in abstinence. Sometimes it's really specific self-directed goals. Sometimes the person wants a lot of help. Sometimes the person would rather have, natural supports and peer supports involved. It's all about what works for the person, and that's what makes it successful. So it's the same thing for our folks. We're meeting them and their supports where they're at. We're working on their goals. We're working on their preferences, and we're using what they're interested in to get them to where they want to go. Motivational interviewing is very non-judgmental. So it's not telling a person they're wrong or their ideas are bad or they can't do this or shouldn't do that. It's literally about sitting down and almost negotiating where we can go, where they are to where they want to be. Again, without that idea that, we're going to control things. So a little bit more specifically about what this is. So it's extremely collaborative in nature. Rapport is absolutely going to be necessary here, and treatment is explained as a partnership between the practitioner and the individual in support. It's very person-centered, so like I just said, it's meeting the individual and the supports where they are. Like I said before, harm reduction works pretty good, but you can utilize pretty much any, positive approach with motivational interviewing. It's positive, it's hopeful, and it's directed with positive regard. So if you have an individual, let's say, that is having a lot of issues with anxiety, maybe has a large trauma history that they're trying to sort through and work with, and maybe they're having a really tough time, and maybe the supports are having a really tough time too, it's not, oh, this is terrible and you really need to change. It's, okay, where do you want to be? Where do you want to go? What are your hopes and dreams? Meeting that person where they're at, and then working with other evidence-based practices, but working with the motivational interviewing to enhance the support, enhance the motivation, and continue to be positive throughout. Whether it's a good day or a bad day, we're there to support and engage. Now, that's not to say you don't ever confront a person or you don't ever point out inconsistencies, because that's actually one of the tricks of the trade for motivational interviewing. And we'll talk more specifically how to do that. But the idea is that you are gently confronting individuals by using their own inconsistencies with, say, thoughts and behaviors, or, promises they're making and then breaking, or assertions they're making about doing things differently, and then maybe the next day they're kind of going back to what they said they didn't want to do. We'll talk more about that, but that should only be utilized to sort of help the individual understand and move the person through that period and focusing on their desired objectives for change. It shouldn't be negative, and it shouldn't be, punishing or meant to put the person down. So like I said, motivational interviewing does have a little bit of jargon. You will hear people talk about the spirit of MI. It's just the general way in the practice of being. Principles of MI, which we've talked about a couple of them. We have some anagrams that we'll talk about that kind of clarify the main focuses and some of the main activities you can do. And Dr. Kumpf will be talking to us a lot about some of the traps to avoid when using MI. Now, just a little caveat, when we get to the traps, these are not things that you would say never ever do in treatment. These are just things that if you're using straight MI, straight motivational interviewing, you would want to stay away from. Again, motivational interviewing pairs well with a lot of other evidence-based practices, so sometimes you may utilize some of those quote-unquote traps that we're going to be talking about avoiding. So kind of the overview, the big umbrella is it's all about collaboration and understanding. MI is done for and with someone, not to, on, or against them. The individual served, and sometimes their supports, is always considered the expert on themselves. So sometimes in working with individuals, Dr. Kumpf and I will hear things like, oh, they don't know what they want. Oh, she doesn't understand what we're talking about. Oh, he doesn't get that. He doesn't really want a job. We don't ever poo-poo what people are saying. We don't ever tell them, you know, oh, that's not right for you, or, oh, you know, that's a terrible goal to want to go to school or work. That's not feasible. What we do is we use what those big hopes and dreams and goals are, and we funnel them down into smaller, more bite-sized objectives and small-term goals so that we can help get the person to where they want to be, or at least closer to it. And all the while, we're going to utilize those big hopes, dreams, and goals as sort of the main focus for treatment and the main reminder about where we're going and why we're doing the things we do. MI is more of a dance than a wrestling match. It isn't bending a person to your will. It's not forcing them to do something. It's working to motivate them so that they want to do it. And the same goes for support. If you've ever worked in family-based services, if you've ever worked with children, especially children with behavioral diagnoses, oftentimes the biggest challenge is getting the family to change, or whoever is taking care of that individual in that moment, whether it's parents or foster families, grandma, grandpa, what have you. It takes a lot to help support that kiddo in that situation. So we always explain when we're working with family units, you know, we're all going to have to sort of flex and pivot and wrap around this person and all get on the same page so that we can move forward. Now, sometimes people say, like, isn't that kind of like manipulation? It's not about tricking people into changing. It's not about false promises, and you don't want to offer false promises. You want to use the person's own ideas for their recovery or for their support or whatever's motivating them for change. And then you want to help align resources, support, and get them to where they want to be, or at least closer to it. It's all about helping someone find their own reasons for wanting to do better and wanting to live a life that's more self-directed and more positive for themselves. We don't push our ideas on people. We don't, you know, give them our values or our judgments, which can sometimes be hard, particularly if the person is doing things that can be dangerous. You know, sometimes, especially with addiction, I've seen practitioners struggle a little bit to employ MI because you are doing a lot of, okay, where are you at and where do you want to be? So if a person comes in who's drinking a case of beer a night, and ideally we want them to come in and be like, you know what, it's caused me problems. I have, you know, DUIs. It's caused me issues with my social life. I'm just going to be done with it. I don't want to drink anymore. I mean, that's fantastic, but that's not where everyone's at least not in the beginning of recovery. Sometimes somebody comes in and says, well, I'd like to be able to just drink 5 beers a night every night. Okay, that's where you're at. That's where you want to go. How do we get you there? What do we need to do? And then working with them over time to, again, help them realize their goal. Now, once the person gets to that point, then you ask, hey, is this where you want to be? Are you satisfied, or are there other things going on? And if there's still a lot of negative consequences, that's where we're going to bring up those inconsistencies again. So we'll talk again a little bit more about those skills, but just so you guys kind of get an idea of the overall feel for this. So as I promised, there are some anagrams that will help you remember the skills and some of the practice principles of MI. So the first one that we like to learn about is ORS or ears. I prefer ears because I think it's a little bit more specific, but you'll see each one in the literature, sometimes both at the same time. So going with the ears, we have E for elaborating. If we were talking about ORS, it would be O for open-ended questioning. I prefer elaborating because especially when you work with individuals who are dually diagnosed and their supports, if you work with adolescents, you can ask an open-ended question, but they still might shut you down or give you a one-word answer. Whereas if I'm focusing on elaborating and getting them to elaborate more on their experience, their thoughts, and their ideas, I can ask a question and then continue to ask for a little bit more information there. So you want to have a really firm understanding of what that person wants, where they think they are, what they think the problems are that are sort of preventing them from meeting their goals, and you want to have a good understanding of what they like and what they don't like. A is for affirming strengths. Even if everything is really, really rough, which sometimes it is in the beginning of treatment, we focus on the positive. Sometimes the best thing you can say in a really tough meeting is, you know what, thank you all for being here. Thank you guys all for not giving up and helping support and helping this person. R for reflections. So reflections are very important in motivational interviewing. Remember, we're trying to get the person to utilize their own understanding and their own motivation for change. So if I'm in a session with somebody and maybe they've been a little resistant, they kind of haven't wanted to be in treatment or they haven't wanted to do counseling, and then they say something like, you know, everybody keeps talking about counseling and I don't know, maybe I should give it a try. I'm going to grab onto that because that's an important statement. That's indicating the person might be ready for change, might be ready to try something new. So I'll reflect it back so that we can kind of hold on to that moment and really attach its importance. Summarizing is sort of similar, but you want to always wrap up the big picture details after a meeting, after a session, if you're doing counseling, after the end of the day, if you're a direct support or maybe a natural support living with a person who is dually diagnosed with mental health and IDD. It's very important that you summarize, sort of, again, bring that attention to, okay, what went good today? What worked well for you? And then what are some things you'd like to maybe do a little bit different? It's not focusing on the negative. So summarizing is not, you know, you hit your friend today and you yelled at the teacher today and you didn't pick up dinner and you didn't do your laundry. It would be focusing on the positive. So again, affirming those strengths and then talking about what change should maybe take place if there are hardships or negative things going on. So in the case of the individual where maybe the day was really, really rough, it would be, you know, maybe today didn't go exactly how you planned. What kind of things do you think went well today? And if they say nothing, it was a crap day, I'll point out what I think went well, right? So I'll say, well, I mean, you were able to notice the things that you want to do differently tomorrow. And that's huge. Think of all the control you have for tomorrow. Tomorrow you'll go in setting the intention that you're not going to hit anybody, that you're going to listen, that you'll do the laundry, and focus on that positive piece for them. Sometimes people need that. Sometimes it's more important that we kind of be a cheerleader for what can go well and what we know they can do rather than reviewing the bad, because it doesn't make anybody feel good and it puts people on the defense. So if I go to my doctor, you know, and maybe my blood sugar is high and my doctor's like, you need to eat better, this is terrible, what are you doing? I'm going to be more likely to be, you know, well, you know, I'm busy, it's hard, it's difficult, right? But if I sit down with my doctor and my blood sugar's high and she say, Kristen, hey, here's the numbers, you know, your blood sugar's at a 304, and I look and maybe I don't know what it should be, right? And she shows me what it should be according to the average, and I say, oh, wow. She says, yeah, I mean, what do you think about that? Are you concerned? I say, well, yeah, what am I supposed to do? Then we can sit and we can talk about options, and I'm going to be more amenable to help than if somebody sits down and goes, you know what, no more sugar, no more cake, no more pie, no more ice cream, you're out of control. So we want to do the same thing in mental health. We want to sit down with the person and we want to say, what do you want to be different? And then work together to figure out how to get there. The traditional medical model of being forceful and being really direct and being kind of judgmental doesn't work good with most people, but certainly not with those who are dually diagnosed. And just to kind of take a moment, too, to think about the supports for our individuals who are dually diagnosed. It's hard to be a natural support of a person who's dually diagnosed. It's hard to be a paid support of a person that's dually diagnosed sometimes. You know, we want the world for our folks. We really care about them. Again, particularly if it's a loved one, a family member, or a friend. You know, you want that person to be able to do what you know they're capable of. But until they're ready to make that change and until they buy into that motivation, you know, you can't drag them through the mud and force them to get better. So we want to utilize these skills to be able to support everyone, not just the individual, but also those people who care for them and treat them. So we talked about oars and ears. Our next anagram is darn cat. So darn cat, as you can see, is desire statement, ability, reason, need, commitment, activation, and taking steps. So let me break these down a little bit. So when you're talking to the person, especially through the assessment phase of treatment, or if you're evaluating how treatment planning is going, you want to kind of look for those indications that the person either wants to change, is making change, or is ready to change in a positive way. So a desire statement would be something like, you know, I want a job. I want to do better. I want to stop hitting people. I want to go to school. When people give you those little tidbits of hope and those really important phrases that say like, hey, I want to do better, I want to do this, I want to do that, you want to make sure that you really kind of grasp onto that. And again, that's where if you're in the point of reflecting and summarizing and reviewing, you want to really put that focus on that, because that's going to be important later on. The next day, if you show up and the person says, you know what, I don't want to do any of this, I don't want to be in treatment, I don't want to go to school, then you can build on that with that inconsistency saying, well, yesterday you were telling me how much you wanted to do this. What happened between yesterday and today that made you change your mind? And then again, you can troubleshoot, right? So if it was just one really bad day, or maybe somebody said something like, oh, you'll never be able to go to college, you'll never be able to do that, maybe that threw them off. And again, we want to sort of bring them back around to the point they were at when they said, hey, I want to do this. Ability statements. These are super important with individuals who are dually diagnosed who have been put into kind of like a passive role or maybe less independent. So this is the I can do this. I think I can do this differently. You know, I believe I can go back to school. I know I can learn to do this by myself. You want to hone in on that because that's really important. That's giving you an indication of where that person sees themselves in the context of their goals. A person believing they have the ability to do something is crucial for change. If they don't think they can do it, then they won't. You know, maybe think of something that you have struggled to change in your life. Maybe it's dieting or exercising or waking up earlier or time management skills or using different strategies with friends and family. Whatever it might be, if you don't believe you can change, you're not going to be able to do it. You have to believe. So you want to hold on to those for people. Reason statements, they're kind of similar to the desire statements, so they're a reason for change. Oftentimes working in substance abuse, if you have a parent, their reason, at least in the beginning, is they want to get their kids back, or they want to get a job, or they want to, you know, live in a better area, or they want to get their license back. So if they're giving you a reason for change, again, you want to hold on to that. Need statements, they're a little bit of a step above a reason. So when someone says to me, you know what, I need to change. I need to stop hitting my staff or I'm never going to be able to move out of this res home. I need to stop yelling at my mom because it's only making our relationship worse. Those little tidbits are very important. You want to focus on them. You want to reflect back. And again, when you have a bad day and the person's like, oh, I don't want to do any of this. You know, what happened about yesterday? You were saying you wanted to go to school and you needed to do things differently to achieve your goal of getting this job. You want to be able to pull them back into that positive piece without focusing again on, oh yeah, today was terrible. We want to stay in that positive for them. Commitment statements are very important because that's the person telling you they're ready to change. So those would be statements like, you know what? I'm not going to hit my mom anymore. I am going to go to school tomorrow. I'm signing up for classes in the fall. I'm going to start taking my medication every day. Activation statements show you that they're ready to actually take the steps or get ready to take the steps for the commitment. So things like, you know what, Monday I have a psychiatric appointment and I'm going to have the doctor tell me about my medication and organize it for me. And then taking steps is how you know the action's taking place. So that's the person actually doing all the things they've talked about. And as you guys know, treatment is not like a perfect trajectory where things go from not so great to wonderful. There are lots of ebbs and flows, and that line goes all over the place. So oftentimes we need to be the person, not only for the individual, but for their supports that's grounded in that positive you can do it attitude. So one more anagram, rules for motivational interviewing. So again, don't put the person in a passive role. Resist giving the individual all the answers about what they should do. Understand the person's motivation and really listen to them. Listen, be person-centered, focus on what that person wants and needs, and be empathic. Our individuals, as well as the folks that support individuals who are dually diagnosed, do not have it easy. You know, sometimes people, I think, get that impression if they don't work in the field. And then you kind of get to know some of the hardships people go through, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. They don't need any more, hey, you should have done this and you should do that. It doesn't work. It just makes people defensive. It damages rapport, and it doesn't change the person anyway. If yelling at somebody would change them, everybody would be great by the time they're, 4 or 5 if they're in that space. But it doesn't. So listen, be empathic, and work to empower the individual in their support. Again, we don't put people in a passive role where we're making all the decisions, we're telling them what to do. We're working to help them build a sense of self-efficacy and have that understanding of, hey, I can do this, I will do this, maybe I need some support, but I know I can do this. We want those self-directed goals. So the spirit of the MI, like I talked about before, that kind of overshadowing piece of what this is, it's a collaboration. It is always going to be, we're going to work on this together. Collaboration is really, really important. If you think about any type of treatment regimen or any type of support, if it's not collaborative, it's not likely to be very good. Take an example. If I go to my PCP tomorrow and I say, hey, I want to eat healthier and I want to lose some weight, and I want to feel better, and I want my sugar under control and this, that, and the other. And my PCP goes, okay, cool. I got the perfect plan for you. So she doesn't collaborate with me at all. She just writes out a plan. And she says, here's your plan. And it's all written out beautifully, step by step, super easy to follow, all things I, in theory, can do. And I look at the plan, and it's like, wake up at 5 a.m., run 10 miles, eat a bowl of lima beans, take a nap, run 5 miles, eat a bowl of lima beans, go to bed at 8 o'clock. In theory, I would probably lose a lot of weight pretty quickly, but there's no way I could follow that. Just with my work schedule and being a parent alone, there's no way I'm going to be in bed at 8:30 like ever. So getting up at 5:30, unless I have to get up that early, it's not going to happen. I hate lima beans. I don't like the texture. They're gross. Lots of other veggies and fruits and things like that are healthy, but no lima beans. Running, definitely not my favorite type of exercise. There's a lot of things I like to do better. So she wrote me this plan, and in theory, it would work, but I'm not going to follow it because I don't want to. I don't like any of the things in it. But if we sit down together and we talk about a healthy sleep cycle, healthy foods, healthy diet, healthy exercise, things that I like and enjoy that also fit into my life, I'm going to be much more likely to practice it. And for some reason, when we talk about mental health treatment for individuals who have an intellectual or developmental disability, sometimes we forget that. And we write a plan and we think our plan's perfect, but it has nothing to do with what they want or what they're interested in or what their supports can do or want to do. Again, we want to kind of evoke that change talk, getting the individual's ideas of what they want. So remember all those anagrams that are in the slides that you could take a peek at again, your ORs and your EARs, rules. There's some other ones like PACE that you'll see in the literature. They kind of help reinforce what you're to be doing with MI. All about the autonomy. It's all about being positive. It's all about being engaged and having a strong rapport, and of course having compassion. So if it's a really rough day, we don't go to, oh, you said you were going to do this and you really screwed that up. We say, yeah, today was kind of rough, but yesterday you did a really good job here and there. What can we do differently tomorrow? What do you need help with? What can I support you with? It is all about that compassion piece with the positivity. And, it has to be honest. It can't be fake. Fake doesn't work with our folks. They'll ferret it out pretty quickly if it's not genuine. So, again, this used to be more of a mental health or addiction methodology. Now it is evidence-based for folks with IDD and co-occurring disorders. So the main thing in using with individuals who are dually diagnosed and their supports is you want to ensure comprehension. So you want to make sure that whatever you're engaging them in, including assessments, including strong collaborative documentation, so that when you're summarizing sessions or you're summarizing plans, you get their direct feedback, and you can ensure that they understand what we're talking about so they can make good decisions with you, so that they can give their input and so that they understand next steps. You want to make sure that the supports are aware of what the person wants and needs. Strong care coordination is extremely important, making sure the left hand knows what the right hand's doing so everybody is on the same page. And one final thing you can do if an individual is dually diagnosed with mental health and IDD is you can use visuals. There are a whole ton of visual supports for IDD and mental health support with MI. I'm going to show you guys one that we used here, and this should be in the attachment. So this first piece is a little visual. It's kind of just like a little grid. And you'll see what this has up here on the top left is you're going to think about a behavior the person wants to change. So let's imagine maybe we have a 16-year-old female that we're working with. She lives with her biological mom and grandma, and biological mom and grandma are really concerned about emotional regulation. Let's say she uses a lot of cutting to support emotional dysregulation, to deal with maybe some past trauma history stuff. So one of the first things I want to do is I want to have a good understanding about why she's using cutting. It's easy for people to say, well, you know, it's in the literature, it's in her history, it says she cuts to feel or she cuts to not feel or she cuts to get attention or whatever. Do yourself a favor and sit down with the individual and do this, or if the individual doesn't have a lot of expressive communication, sit down with a support group to know them best. So you would write down the behavior. So for this example, cutting. So the good things about cutting, and then you would list everything good that it does. And by good, I mean, why do you do it, right? Then the not so good thing about cutting. So maybe the good things the individual says, again, in this example, a 16-year-old female living with bio mom and grandma, and she says, you know what, it makes me feel better. Sometimes I just get so stressed out and I want to cry and I can't. I want to scream and my mom gets upset if I start yelling, and I cut and I feel like I can breathe and I feel like I can calm. Write that stuff down. Then the not so good things. So what's bad about this? Why do you want to change it? This is going to give you, again, all your understanding of what's going on in her world that says, you know what, this isn't working so well for me. Then the good things about changing whatever behavior you're focusing on. So what would be good about using a different coping skill rather than cutting? And then what would be the not so good things about changing? Sometimes I explain to people is, tell me what's hard to change here. If the behavior wasn't hard to change, they'd just do it. There's some reason that it's not easy. And if you're working with that individual or close supports, this grid will help you figure out the why they do it, why they want to stop, why they have a hard time stopping, and a lot of information about those specifics that you're going to need to use MI. And it gives them a nice little visual. Again, we want to make sure that people have a good understanding of their own thoughts and feelings about behaviors. And then this one's just like a little Likert scale you can use to kind of gauge motivation. So on a scale of 0 to 10, how important is it you right now to change? And I would write in specific behaviors. Not at all important at 0, very important at 10. And then on a scale of 0 to 10, how confident are you that you can make this change? So if someone says, you know, I'm at a 10 for how important it is for me to change. I want to stop this cutting now. I don't want to do it anymore. I just, you know, I struggle. And then I get down here and I ask about the confidence level for changing the cutting, and they have it at a 1 or a 2. I'm going to say, okay, so we have a big discrepancy here. On one hand, you want to stop this. You recognize it's causing this problem for you. You don't like that it's doing that. You talked about the family stuff and mom and grandma getting really upset, and, you know, risk of injury and infection, and you don't like the way it looks, et cetera, but you're not feeling very confident you can change. Why is that? Why don't you feel you can change? So you see, you can kind of use these two visuals in conjunction with one another to really help you work with the individual and support specifically on the motivation to change certain behaviors. So I know I've kind of thrown a lot in this first piece of this. I'm going to actually turn this over now to Dr. Kumpf, and he's going to talk a little bit more about MI, starting with what you don't want to do when you're using MI. Dr. Kumpf?
Thank you, Kristen. Kristen provided us with a great overview of the motivational interviewing approach, as it relates to working with the dually diagnosed population. And as she just mentioned, I'm going to talk through some of the things that you're going to want to stay away from when utilizing this approach in an intentional way. So with that being said, just to start us off, one of the biggest overarching challenges or pitfalls that practitioners fall into is working from that expert role. So when you think about the expert role in general, one of the things that it does is that oftentimes will create a hierarchical relationship between the professional and the individual. It's really hard to have a collaborative relationship if the individual doesn't necessarily have a voice in his or her own care. So something you're going to want to stay away from, as you move forward. In addition to that, another one of the challenges is the idea of pathologizing individuals. Individuals are more than the product of their diagnosis, obviously. So we're going to want to treat individuals as individuals and really emphasize those strengths, those positive aspects of the self, as opposed to focusing on the challenges. And as you can see on the slides here, we have some examples. The big one here is she's a borderline. Definitely going to want to stay away from those types of things. The other big piece is, and this kind of walks hand in hand with the pathologizing approach, is the idea of being judgmental or accusatory. Again, looking to be positive, looking to be engaging, looking to collaborate with the individual in an intentional way is the key, as opposed to engaging in that power struggle. The other big piece here is being realistic in terms of the change process, recognizing that change is a process and not an event, and helping to educate the individual on that process is also equally important. If you have an unrealistic expectation for that change process, most likely that's going to bleed into the relationship with the consumer, and they're going to have a difficult time responding or adapting or participating in that process of change. So here we have a visual representation of the motivational interviewing process, just for comparison purposes. So if you have an individual that's ambivalent or resistant or disengaged with regard to the process of change, obviously the thing that you're going to want to stay away from the most is confronting that ambivalence head on. And when you get into a confrontation, you also get into a power struggle. So what that becomes more about is keeping individuals where they are, which then leads to that resistive approach that we mentioned earlier, which ultimately leads to no change. If you utilize the motivational interviewing approach, including some of the principles that Kristen highlighted with SPIRIT principles and ORS, the focus takes on a more positive orientation in terms of the change. So it becomes about what you can do differently, what you can do other than what you have been doing to produce a different outcome. And then it's easier to get a commitment or buy-in from an individual at that point if he or she feels like they're being heard, if their wants, desires, hopes, dreams, goals are being highlighted, and you're helping the individual in a collaborative way to identify clear, actionable steps that can lead to that change, more likely to get a person to commit to doing something differently as opposed to doing what they've been doing or what they've always done, which ultimately will lead to that change piece that we're looking for. So as Kristen already mentioned earlier in the training, motivational interviewing is not a structured set of steps that you follow, first do number 1, 2, 3, 4, almost like a recipe. Instead, it's more of a style of engagement, a way of interacting in an intentional and authentic way with individuals. So with that being said, one thing to consider, when you think about those relational dynamics, the idea of establishing a therapeutic alliance or rapport, those obvious principles such as unconditional positive regard, accurate empathetic understanding, and genuineness are going to be key here. You're going to want to incorporate those in an intentional way. And with that being said, anytime that you think about engagement within a therapeutic context, there are definitely some things that you're going to want to stay away from as well, which we're going to highlight here in the next few slides. So the first one is the question and answer trap. That's just the rapid fire question approach where, the individual feels like they're participating in an interrogation, one question after the other. And again, the individual is just rapidly responding to you. And again, there's no real investment in terms of that engagement piece or building that relationship. So the relationship has no foundation or no ground. You just go right into the questions. And a lot of times as a result, the relationship can't support that type of engagement. And then as a result, the individual disengages, or the person becomes defensive, or the person becomes reactive or resistant to the process, or they just become generally irritated. And again, if you're not mindful of those dynamics, you run the risk of fracturing that relationship right out of the gate before you really have an opportunity to even establish a therapeutic relationship that's of substance. The next one is the labeling trap, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. That's that pathologizing orientation, focusing on an individual's diagnosis or focusing on symptomatology specifically. So in essence, the individual becomes the symptomatology or the diagnosis as opposed to a unique individual with positive elements or characteristics or features. And again, if an individual gets a sense that they're being labeled or that they're being pathologized, they're going to disengage from you. They're going to shut down. They're not going to be willing to explore any alternative approaches, and they're going to be more inclined to be in whatever the problem is, as opposed to moving towards some type of a constructive solution. They're not going to move toward a solution if they're not able to collaborate with you. They're not going to be able to collaborate with you if they feel disconnected because they're being judged. And a lot of times that's one of the biggest challenges that comes with that labeling or that pathologizing, is a person feels like they're not being seen as an individual, as a person, or as a human being. They feel like they're being seen as a set of symptoms. And that's a challenge and that's a problem. Premature focus trap. This is where the counselor spends more time framing the issue, the problem, the concern from their own point of view, as opposed to getting the buy-in from the consumer, the client, or the individual. So it's more important to see how the individual sees the challenge or the issue or the problem as opposed to how you see it. As in any therapeutic situation, the consumer, the client, or the individual is the expert. The professional is. And this is one of the ways of offsetting that the hierarchy, in calling that out right from the beginning of the process, that the individual understands where he or she is. And not only that, but the individual understands what he or she wants or needs. And that's the important thing to recognize, is that all individuals have hopes, wants, needs. And our role as a support or as a professional is to help align with the individual, to help them identify what he or she can do to move forward in a constructive way towards the resolution that they want, as opposed to what it is that we think necessarily needs to happen. If it's about us and not about the consumer, again, it's a good way to fracture or undermine that therapeutic relationship. The writing reflex. This is, again, the overarching need for the professional to step in and fix the problem. And a lot of times that comes along with a directive or a directive-based approach. This is telling an individual what to do, as opposed to being more focused on what the individual is willing to do. Big difference. And again, no one likes to be told what to do, whether it's in a therapeutic context or in any other context. So if we're directive-based as opposed to being collaborative and engaging, you run the risk of fracturing that relationship, and you run the risk of reinforcing the idea of the individual staying where he or she is, because they're not going to feel like they're being heard or seen or valued or appreciated for who they are, including their frustrations and all of what those might entail. The blaming trap. I feel like this is one that a lot of professionals can fall into. And again, it's at times individuals may blame other people or situations for their current functioning. We want to make sure that we don't jump on that blame wagon, as it says here on the slides. This is about being in the solution and not the problem, not buying into a compounding effect where everyone else is responsible for a person's process. It's about empowering the individual, engaging the individual, encouraging the individual to move forward in an intentional and positive way that aligns with their hopes and dreams, once again. So it's about matching the hopes, wants, and needs with actionable behavior that would lead to the desired outcome. And then validating and acknowledging and supporting the change and the behavior that the individual is willing to engage in. That's a really big piece. And again, Kristen talked about that a little bit earlier in the presentation, that positive orientation, that positive style of engagement. Those are all core principles and useful interventions or ways of engaging that you can use to really enhance a person's motivation to move forward. The next one is the expert trap, and we talked about this already a little bit earlier. The professional is the all-knowing oracle, and the individual is supposed to listen to the professional in every way. Again, this really highlights the hierarchical relationship with which is a challenge, and it plays down the notion of being collaborative or supportive, or bringing the individual's voice into the engagement. So just to summarize, again, motivational interviewing is not a set structure, but a style of engagement that's effective with working with individuals with a dual diagnosis, as well as other populations as well. Kristen mentioned the substance abuse population, where this sort of originated from. But it's definitely a style of engagement that can be used with any population in an intentional way, because it really utilizes principles of the core essence of what it means to develop a structured therapeutic alliance or relationship with an individual in a therapeutic context. So a lot of these principles are things that all mental health professionals are already aware of. They just might be a little bit more structured in a different way through utilizing that motivational interviewing approach. But most of these things are things that you're already doing, which is a good thing. So if you choose to utilize this approach with the dually diagnosed population, you can do so with confidence in knowing that you're probably doing a lot of these things well as you engage consumers already. So again, just highlighting, the motivational interviewing as a core style that can be utilized both with individuals and supports. There are also some times when you might want to deviate from this approach, and it's important to highlight those as well. So, for example, if you have an individual that's engaging in serious self-harm, a parent or support that's abusive, a consumer support that's engaging in a behavior that requires mandated reporting, so on and so forth, you're definitely going to want to use a more direct approach of engagement to address some of these crisis-related concerns. But again, if you need to use a more direct approach, you definitely want to look to incorporate a lot of those person-centered principles that motivational interviewing highlights when appropriate. Because again, you want to make sure as much as possible that you have the individual's active voice as part of the process, and you're really trying to work in a collaborative way to the extent that you can, even in the face of a crisis, to ensure that that individual's hopes, dreams, desires, wants, needs are still at the forefront of the process every step of the way. And at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Kristen, who is going to wrap things up for our presentation this afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Kump. Thank you guys for joining us today. This is something that is definitely near and dear to our hearts because it works really well. It partners really well. You don't have to have a license to do it. You don't have to be of a specific discipline to do it. Like I said, you can do it if, you're a mom working with your child. You can do it if you're a psychiatrist working with your clients. Anybody in between, direct support, paid support, natural support, anyone really that's involved. I joked earlier saying I use it for customer service all the time if I have an issue with a product, because if I kind of call and explain and then listen to that person and if I'm empathic with them, if you're on hold for an hour, oh, you guys must be really busy. Oh, yeah, we're slammed. Oh, I'll bet. You're going to get better results. And it's definitely true in supporting people. When you're working with someone and you're working to support them and motivating them to change something, it has to be on their terms or it's not going to work. And if it does work, it's not going to stick. Trying to force somebody to do something never goes well. It doesn't feel good. It creates a lot of reactivity. And we see that a lot in really structured settings with our adults who are dually diagnosed. It's a lot of that kind of like bending somebody to the will. Residential treatment facilities for youth, they're great to provide structure and they can do a lot of good for individuals. But what happens oftentimes is the individual goes to the facility, they go to the institution, they stay at the inpatient hospital, they go to the stabilization unit, and they're there for 3 months and they come out, and what happens? Everything goes right back to the way it was because there's no intrinsic motivation to change. So we try and capitalize on that. And again, it's done in a way that is all about what's best for the individual and letting them make some choices, decisions, and helping them to understand themselves a little bit better. It really is a useful tool. You can combine it with just about any discipline, more of a style than a set of phases. It's not too hard to employ. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to it. But if you're interested in learning more or you'd like to know about some of the information that we highlighted, there is a reference page. You can find tons of information on motivational interviewing. I know some of the universities, some of the hospital systems do certifications in motivational interviewing. That can be a great way to really learn and practice if you want to learn more. If you have any other questions about motivational interviewing or about any of the dual diagnosis services that Marikey has, please feel free to use, Dr. Kump's email, or you can reach out to him and we can certainly point you in the right direction if you have any other questions or you'd like to learn more.